What kind of peace deal do you think is possible, feasible, optimal in Ukraine? If you sat down, you became president, if you sat down with Zelenskyy and sat down with Putin, what do you think is possible to talk to them about? One of the hilarious things you did, which were intense and entertaining, your debates in the primary. But anyway, is how you grilled the other candidates that didn't know any regions. They wanted to send money and troops and lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, and they didn't know any of the regions in Ukraine.
Yeah.
You had a lot of zingers in that one. But anyway, how do you think about negotiating with world leaders about what's going on there?
Yeah, so look, I think that let's just get the self-interest of each party on the table. And it's to be very transparent about it. From everyone's perspective, they think the other side is the aggressor or whatever. Just get it on the table. Russia is concerned about NATO shifting the balance of power away from Russia to Western Europe when NATO has expanded far more than they expected to. And frankly, that Russia was told that NATO was going to expand. It's an uncomfortable fact for some in America, but James Baker made a commitment to Mikhail Gorbachev in the early 90s, where he said NATO would expand not 1 inch past East Germany. Well, NATO's expanded far more after the fall of the USSR than it did during the existence of the USSR. And that is a reality we have to contend with. That's the Russian perspective. From the Western perspective, the hard fact is Russia was the aggressor in this conflict, crossing the boundaries of a sovereign nation. And that is a violation of international norms, and it's a violation of the recognition of international law. Nations without borders are not a nation. And so against that backdrop, what's the actual interest of each country here? I think if we're able to do a reasonable deal that gives Russia the assurances it needs about what they might allege as NATO expansionism violating prior commitments, but get codified commitments for Russia that we're not going to see willy-nilly behavior of just randomly deciding they're going to violate the sovereignty of neighboring nations and have hard assurances and consequences for that. That's the beginnings of a deal. But then I want to be ambitious for the United States. I want to weaken the Russia-China alliance. And I think that we can do a deal that gives some real gives to Russia, conditioned on Russia withdrawing itself from its military alliance with China. And this could be good for Russia, too, in the long run, because right now, Vladimir Putin does not enjoy being Xi Jinping's little brother in that relationship. But Russia's military, combined with China's naval capacity and Russia's hypersonic missiles and China's economic might, together those countries in an alliance pose a real threat to the United States. But if as a condition for a reasonable discussion about where different territories land, given what's occupied right now, hard requirements that Russia remove its military presence from the Western Hemisphere. People forget this. Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, we don't want a Russian military presence in the Western Hemisphere. That too would be a win for the United States. No more joint military exercises with China off the coast of the Aleutian Islands. The kinds of wins that the United States wants to protect the West's security, get Russia out of the Western Hemisphere, certainly out of the North American periphery, and then also make sure that Russia's no longer in that military alliance with China. In return for that, able to provide Russia some things that are important to Russia, we'd have to have a reasonable discussion about what the territorial concessions would be at the end of this war to bring it to peace and resolution, and what the guarantees are to make sure that NATO is going to not expand beyond the scope of what the United States has at least historically guaranteed. That, I think, together would be a reasonable deal that gives every party what they're looking for, that results in immediate peace, that results in greater stability, and most importantly, weakening the Russia-China alliance, which I think is the actual threat that we have so far, no matter who in this debate of more or less Ukraine funding has really failed to confront. That, I think, is the way we de-escalate the risk of World War III and weaken the threats to the West by actually dismantling that alliance.
So from the American perspective, the main interest is weakening the alliance between Russia and China.
Yes. I think the military alliance between Russia and China represents the single greatest threat we face. Yeah. So do a deal that's very reasonable across the board, but one of the main things we get out of it is weakening that alliance. So no joint military exercises, no military collaborations. These are monitorable. These are monitorable attributes. If there's cheating on that, we're going to immediately have consequences as a consequence of their cheating. But we can't cheat on, our own obligations that we would make in the context of that deal as well.
There might be some extremely painful things for Ukraine here. So Ukraine currently captured a small region in Russia, the Kursk region, but Russia has captured giant chunks, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson regions. So it seems, given what you're laying out, it's very unlikely for Russia to give up any of the regions it's already captured.
I actually think that that would come down to the specifics of the negotiation. But the core goals of the negotiation are peace in this war, weaken the Russia-China alliance. And for Russia, what do they get out of it? Part of this is, here's something that's not negative for Ukraine, but that could be positive for Russia as part of that deal, right? Because it's not a zero-sum game alone with Ukraine on the losing end of this. I think reopening economic relations with the West would be a big win for Russia, but also a carrot that gets them out of that military relationship with China. So I do think that the foreign policy establishment has historically been, at the very least, unimaginative about the levers that we're able to use. Actually, I was a little bit critical of Nixon earlier in this discussion for his contribution to the overgrowth of the U.S. entitlement state and regulatory state. But I'll give Nixon credit here on a different point, which is that he was imaginative of being able to pull Red China out from the clasp of the USSR. He broke the China-Russia alliance back then, which was an important step to bring us to the near end of the Cold War. So I think there's an opportunity for a similar unconventional maneuver now of using greater reopened economic relations with Russia to pull Russia out from the hands of China today. There's no skin off Ukraine's back for that. And I do think that's a big carrot for Russia in this direction. I do think that will involve some level of territorial negotiation as well, that, out of any good deal, not everyone's going to like 100% of what comes out of it. But that's part of the cost of securing peace, is that not everyone's going to be happy about every attribute. But I could make a case that an immediate peace deal is also now in the best interests of Ukraine. Let's just rewind the clock. We're looking at now, let's just say we're early 2022, maybe June of 2022. Zelenskyy was ready to come to the table for a deal back then, until Boris Johnson traveled when he had his own domestic political travails to convince Zelenskyy to continue to fight. And that goes to the point where when nations aren't asked to pay for their own national security, they have what the problem is of moral hazard of taking risks that really are suboptimal risks for them to take because they're not bearing the consequences of taking those risks, not fully in the cost. If Ukraine had done a deal back then, I think it is unambiguous that they would have done a better deal for themselves than they're doing now after having spent hundreds of billions of dollars and expended tens of thousands of Ukrainian lives. So the idea that Ukraine is somehow better off because it failed to do that deal before is a lie. And if we're not willing to learn from those mistakes of the recent past, we're doomed to repeat them again. So this idea that it would be painful for Ukraine, what's been painful? Tens and tens and tens of thousands of people continuing to die without any increased leverage in actually getting the outcome that they want. So I think there's an opportunity for a win-win-win. A win for the United States and the West more broadly in weakening the Russia-China alliance. A win for Ukraine in having an agreement that is backstopped by the United States of America's interests that provides a greater degree of long-run security to the future existence of Ukraine and its sovereignty, and also stopping the bloodshed today. And I think a win for Russia, which is to reopen economic relations with the West and have certain guarantees about what the mission creep or scope creep of NATO will be. There's no rule that says that when one party, before a full outright world war starts at least, there's an opportunity for there to actually be a win for everybody on the table rather than to assume that a win for us is a loss to Russia or that anything positive that happens for Russia is a loss for the United States or Ukraine.
Just to add to the table some things that Putin won't like, but I think are possible to negotiate, which is Ukraine joining the European Union and not NATO. So establishing some kind of economic relationships there, and also splitting the bill, sort of guaranteeing some amount of money from both Russia and the United States for rebuilding Ukraine. Because one of the challenges in Ukraine, a war-torn country, is how do you guarantee the flourishing of this particular nation, right? So you want to not just stop the death of people and the destruction, but also provide a foundation on which you can rebuild the country and build a flourishing future country.
I think out of this conversation alone, there are a number of levers on the table for negotiation in a lot of different directions. And that's where you want to be, right? If there's only one factor that matters to each of the two parties, and those are their red line factors, then there's no room for negotiation. This is a deeply complicated, historically intricate dynamic between Ukraine and Russia, and between NATO and the United States and the Russia-China alliance, and economic interests that are at issue combined with the geopolitical factors. There are a lot of levers for negotiation, and the more levers there are, the more likely there is to be a win-win-win deal that gets done for everybody. So I think it should be encouraging. The fact that there are as many different possible levers here almost makes certain that a reasonable, practicable peace deal is possible. In contrast to a situation where there's only one thing that matters for each side, then I can't tell you that there's a deal to be done. There's definitely a deal to be done here. And I think that it requires real leadership in the United States playing hardball, not just with one side of this, not just with Zelenskyy or with Putin, but across the board, hardball for our own interests, which are the interests of stability here. And I think that will happen to well serve both Ukraine and Russia in the process.
If you were president, would you call Putin?
Absolutely. I mean, in any negotiation, you got to manage when you're calling somebody and when you're not. But I do believe that open conversation and the willingness to have that as another lever in the negotiation is totally fair game.